52 minutes. That's how long it took. I checked my watch when the first shot cracked the morning open, checked it again when Lieutenant Morrison finally called ceasefire. In that span, 32 men died without ever seeing what killed them. The Japanese swept our ridge 3 times looking for a sniper position, checked every foxhole, every fallen log, every depression in the mud. They walked within arm's reach of Jimmy Voss 6 different times. He was wrapped in tree bark like a second skin, breathing through his nose absolutely still. They never looked up. This was November 19th, 1944, on Leyte Island in the Philippines. Our company, what was left of it anyway, was dug in on a ridge that didn't have a name, not on any map we'd seen, just another piece of jungle in a war that had turned into a nightmare of rain and mud and men dying in places their families would never be able to find on a globe. We were part of the 3rd to 2nd Infantry Division, the Red Arrow Boys, though by that point we didn't feel much like arrows, more like nails somebody kept hammering into the same wet board. General MacArthur had returned to the Philippines like he promised, but the returning part looked a lot different than the recruitment posters. It looked like triple canopy rainforest, so thick you couldn't see the sky. It looked like ridges that appeared and disappeared in fog. It looked like 47 exhausted men holding a nameless hill because somebody at battalion said it mattered. I was 20 years old, private first class, rifleman. Sometimes they'd send me out with the scouts when we needed an extra pair of eyes. That morning, I wished I'd been assigned to anything else. Cook duty, latrine digging, anything. But I was in a foxhole on that ridge with my M1 and 3 days of ammunition and the growing certainty that 3 days wasn't going to be enough. The rain had stopped 2 hours before dawn, but everything was still wet. That's how it was on Leyte. Even when it wasn't raining, you were soaked. Your uniform rotted on your body. Your boots fell apart. Trench foot turned men's feet into something that didn't look human anymore. We'd been on that ridge for 72 hours with maybe 10 hours of real sleep between us. The kind of tired where you forget what being awake is supposed to feel like. Mail call came at 0400 before the light. Corporal Jimmy Voss got a letter from his kid sister back in Kentucky. I remember because he laughed. First real laugh I'd heard from anyone in 6 weeks. He showed me the drawing she'd included. A dog. Their family dog, I guess. She'd written across the bottom, "Do you still climb trees like you used to?" Jimmy folded it careful, tucked it in his breast pocket. Said his sister was 12 years old and didn't understand what the war was. He said it like that was a good thing. Jimmy was 23, designated marksman, carried an M1903 Springfield with a scope, old rifle, but he could do things with it that made Sergeant Dalton shake his head in appreciation. Jimmy was from hill country, grew up hunting, deer, turkey, whatever put food on the table. He had that quietness some country boys have, not shy, just economical, didn't waste words, didn't waste motion. By 0430, Lieutenant Morrison had us at fighting positions. Morrison was West Point. Decent enough officer, but the jungle had him confused. You could see it in how he looked at the terrain. In training, you learn fields of fire, clear sight lines, interlocking positions. But the mahogany forest didn't care about West Point. You couldn't see 40 yards in any direction. The canopy was so dense that even with the rain stopped, water kept dripping down like it was still pouring. Morrison kept walking the line, checking positions, asking Sergeant Dalton questions. Dalton had fought at Buna back in New Guinea. He limped from shrapnel he'd taken 8 months earlier, but refused to leave his squad. Dalton didn't say much, but when he talked, everyone listened. That morning, Morrison asked him how we were supposed to defend what we couldn't see through. Dalton just looked at the trees and said, "We'll manage." At 0445, the jungle went silent. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. Every bird call stopped at once. The insects went still. Even the dripping seemed to pause. I'd been in combat long enough to know what that meant. Sergeant Dalton knew it instantly. He didn't raise his voice, just said it flat. "They're close. Multiple squads, maybe company strength." Morrison ordered everyone to fighting positions. We'd been at fighting positions for 3 days, but now it meant something different. Now it meant checking your ammunition count. Now it meant making sure your rifle wasn't clogged with mud. Now it meant whispering prayers if you were the praying type, and most of us were by that point. Jimmy grabbed his Springfield, started stripping equipment off his webbing, took off his pack, his entrenching tool, everything that made noise or added weight. I watched him walk toward the stream bed behind our position, scoop up handfuls of red clay. Then he moved toward the biggest mahogany tree on the ridge's forward slope. Sergeant Dalton watched him go, didn't say a word to stop him. I followed part way, curious. Jimmy was gathering strips of bark from the forest floor. Pieces that had fallen naturally still had the texture and color of living wood. He smeared that red clay across his uniform, thick, then pressed the bark pieces onto it, covered his shoulders, his back, his helmet, worked fast but careful. Then he slung his rifle and started climbing. That mahogany tree had to be 200 years old, massive trunk, branches thick as a man's torso spreading out 80 feet up. Jimmy climbed like he'd done it his whole life, didn't rush, found good handholds, tested each branch. I watched him disappear into the canopy and tried to keep track of where he was. Lost him 4 times. Even knowing exactly which tree he'd climbed, I couldn't find him in all that bark and shadow and leaf. He positioned himself where 3 major branches met, created a kind of natural platform. From the ground, he was invisible, not hidden, invisible. The bark he'd pressed to his uniform matched the tree's texture so perfectly that your eye just slid right past him. I looked directly at his position and saw nothing but tree. Sergeant Dalton came up beside me, looked up at the canopy, nodded once. "His grandfather taught him to turkey hunt that way," Dalton said. "Told me about it once. Said you don't chase turkeys. You become part of the landscape and wait for them to come to you." Then Dalton walked back to his position, and I went back to mine. The fog started thinning as sunrise approached. 05:15 maybe. Light coming sideways through the trees, everything green and gold and silver with moisture. Beautiful, if you could forget what was about to happen. But we couldn't forget. First visual contact came at 05:20. Shadows moving through the trees, 200 yards out. Professional movement. 3-man teams, leapfrogging, covering each other. These weren't conscripts. These were experienced soldiers who knew what they were doing. Morrison passed word down the line. Nobody fires until they're on top of us. Make every round count. I tried to find Jimmy in the canopy one more time. Looked right at his tree. Nothing. Just bark and branches and that sideways light. The Japanese advance was textbook. They moved on a trail we didn't even know existed. bypassing our forward positions completely. They were headed for the reverse slope, where our command post was, where we'd staged our ammunition. Morrison's face went white when he realized it. We weren't getting flanked. We were about to be overrun from behind. At 0527 hours, I heard the crack of a Springfield rifle from somewhere above and ahead. Single shot, clean. A Japanese soldier 80 yards out dropped mid-stride like somebody had cut his strings. The soldiers around him froze, trying to locate the shot. They assumed ground level, started suppressing our foxholes with rifle fire. We returned fire because we had to. But I was watching the tree line. 90 seconds later, another shot from the canopy, another body. The Japanese couldn't pattern it. They were firing at our positions, throwing grenades, advancing under proper cover, but every time they tried to coordinate, every time a team leader stood up to give orders, another shot, another man down. I could see their confusion turning into something else. Panic sounds the same in any language. Their officers were shouting, pointing toward our foxholes, but the shots kept coming from an angle that didn't make sense. High angle, plunging fire, impossible to trace because the acoustic signature bounced through that canopy like it was coming from everywhere at once. At one point, I watched through the chaos as a Japanese officer walked within 15 feet of Jimmy's tree, stood directly underneath it, trying to coordinate a flanking movement, pointing, shouting orders, single shot. The officer collapsed. The soldiers around him scattered, firing wildly in every direction except up. They never thought to look up. Jimmy was targeting their leadership first. Officers, NCOs, anyone giving orders, then radio operators, then machine gun teams, anyone trying to coordinate the attack. And he never fired twice from the same position. I figured that out later. He'd shift between branches after each shot, keeping the Japanese from establishing a pattern. They thought they were facing multiple snipers in prepared positions. The firefight turned absolute. Both sides pouring rounds into the jungle. I stopped counting shots fired, just loaded and fired, trying to keep my sector clear. But through all of it, every 90 to 120 seconds, that Springfield cracked from above and another Japanese soldier went down. At 0547, they tried a mass rush, tried to overrun our position through sheer momentum. I saw 3 Japanese soldiers take cover behind Jimmy's tree trunk right at the base. They were 50 feet directly below him, reloading, breathing hard. Jimmy didn't shoot, couldn't. Movement would have given him away. They stayed there for 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. When they ran out to rejoin the attack, 3 shots in 3 seconds, they dropped within yards of each other. By 0610, the Japanese were pulling back, disorganized, carrying wounded. They'd lost all their officers, all their NCOs, couldn't coordinate a fighting retreat. Jimmy kept firing slower now. His barrel had to be overheating, limited ammunition. I watched through my binoculars as a Japanese soldier stopped to help a wounded comrade. Jimmy had the shot. Clean line. He didn't take it. Let them go. At 0619, Jimmy fired his last round. Then silence. Morrison called cease fire at 0625. The jungle went quiet again, but different this time, broken only by wounded men calling for medics, theirs and ours. Patterson, our medic, started moving through the positions. 3 Americans killed, 11 wounded. Morrison sent scouts forward to count enemy dead. They came back with the number, 32 confirmed, minimum 15 wounded, evacuated. Jimmy climbed down at 0640. slow. His hands were shaking so badly he almost fell twice. His uniform was still covered in bark and clay, face streaked with mud and sweat. His rifle barrel was too hot to touch. He walked past all of us without speaking, sat down behind the command post foxhole, vomited twice, adrenaline crash, exhaustion, everything hitting him at once. I brought him a canteen. He drank, said nothing, just stared at his hands. Later that morning, Sergeant Dalton and I went forward to examine the positions. We found Jimmy's tree. Even knowing where to look, it took minutes to spot where he'd been. Dalton picked up strips of bark that had fallen during the fight, studied how Jimmy had layered them, pressed them with clay to match the tree's texture. Dalton was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been fighting in jungles for 2 years. Never seen anything like that." Battalion intelligence wanted details. Morrison reported the action over the radio. The intelligence officer didn't believe it at first. One man, elevated position, 32 kills in under an hour. They sent up a documentation team, photographed the tree, interviewed witnesses. The report went into files marked Tactical Innovations, Jungle Warfare. Morrison tried to get Jimmy a medal. It got lost in division paperwork somewhere. We held that ridge for 6 more days. No further attacks. The Japanese had learned. Resupply finally reached us on November 20th. By December 3rd, we'd rotated off the line. Jimmy got a field promotion to sergeant. He never used the tree bark technique again. Said it only worked once. Said the enemy learns. The supply route we'd defended got abandoned anyway. The Japanese shifted to a different valley. The ridge was never named, never marked on maps as significant. By December, the fighting had moved 50 miles north. The 32nd Division would lose 1,800 men before Leyte was secured. Our action was a footnote in a footnote. Jimmy never talked about that morning, shut down completely when anyone asked. I noticed he stopped reading his sister's letters out loud. He kept that drawing in his pocket until it disintegrated from moisture and rain. After the war, he went back to Kentucky, became a forestry worker. He died in 1998. His obituary made no mention of military service. I've spent 80 years trying to make sense of that morning. Not the tactics. Those make sense. Jimmy saw a problem, found a solution using what he knew. That's just soldiering. What I can't square is the mathematics of it. 32 men walking through jungle they knew better than we did, following orders from officers they trusted, doing their jobs the same way we were doing ours. And then, nothing. Just gone. Because a kid from Kentucky remembered how to hunt turkey and had the patience to become part of a tree for 52 minutes. I think about their families sometimes, the letters that got sent home. Your son died in combat in the Philippines. True enough, but incomplete. How do you write? He walked under a mahogany tree and didn't look up. How does a mother make sense of that? Jimmy saved 43 of us that day. That's true, too. Without him, the Japanese would have rolled up our position, killed most of us, taken the ridge. 3 of the guys he saved went home, became fathers. I'm holding my great-granddaughter's picture right now because Jimmy Voss knew how to press bark to wet clay. But I also know he carried those 32 men with him for 54 years. Saw them every time he looked at a mahogany tree, which, in Kentucky, you can't hardly avoid. He never said it, but I knew. You don't walk away clean from something like that, even when you did it right, even when you saved your brothers. War doesn't deal in fair mathematics. We measure it wrong when we count just the living or just the dead. The real weight is in the space between the men who came home carrying ghosts, the families on both sides who lost everything, the silence in a jungle that got loud again like nothing happened. I'm 96 years old now. Jimmy's been gone 27 years. The ridge probably has a name by now, or maybe it doesn't. Doesn't change what happened there. Some mornings when it rains, I still smell wet bark and gunpowder, and I remember